welcome to the T-Fix podcast. I'm Leona Liu, here with my co-host, Geoff Norman, and Geoff is Skyping in from Portland, Oregon. Geoff, how are you?
Fantabulous. How are you?
I am fantabulous as well. I was trying to make up a new word, but I couldn't do it. So then I just copied you. And what are you drinking today?
I am drinking a white tea from Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
And the really cool thing about it is I bought it at the Portland Tea Festival, which was back in July.
Okay.
From this company called the Astoria Coffee Roasters, or Astoria Coffee Company and Deli. I've never actually been to said coffee operation / deli, but this particular tea is grown on a coffee plantation.
Interesting. Nice face, Geoff. And that's actually the topic of today's episode, which is tea versus coffee. And so we'll be talking about the similarities, differences, and the tea and coffee experiences that are kind of going on in the industry. And So before we start, I wanted to kind of read a little bit of our listener feedback. One is on YouTube, and this is in reference to our 鸭屎香 episode. It's a type of oolong, and this is from Nelson Kidd, and he said in reference to the name having a shock value. He said there's definitely a mass market benefit for having a memorable shock value name. The Chinese names you're using for teas are going to be difficult for people to remember. And I would agree with that. A lot of the CH, ZH, SH sounds that are in a lot of the Chinese words are actually very difficult to pronounce. They kind of come from the back here of your kind of throat to make those like ch, z, those sounds. So I would agree with you, Nelson. Good.
As a man who is very much not Chinese, I tend to agree, and I will.
Geoff, you're not.
I will attest that most of the pronunciations I use for Chinese words are probably wrong. That's why I have to defer to your example to how to pronounce it correctly. Like for the longest time, I didn't know that ya shi was pronounced ya shi. I was pronouncing it ya shi, which probably might be something entirely different in Chinese, or anything at all. I don't know.
Ya shi xiang and if you want to find a kind of a list of other oolongs with a lot of these names, you can go on what was it, Yunnan Sourcing for all of these oolongs. So on today's episode, we are talking about tea versus coffee, and just a quick little history on the coffee and tea history in the U.S. It kind of started with this. So tea was the main beverage of choice by the colonists up until the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And then at that point, so sad, many tears by Geoff.
Well, the reason being is because I've actually seen the manifest of some of the teas that were dumped overboard by said racially insensitively disguised Americans that were dumping it over a perfectly good harbor. Yeah. And while I understand the reason they were doing it, they were tossing over Wu Yi oolongs.
They weren't.
A lot of people think that the teas that were labeled as bohi were not just Lapsang Souchong or Wu Yi Mountain Minghongs, but rather some of them might have been roasted Wu Yi oolongs that also made it to shore. But because of their black appearance, were considered black teas at the time because nobody in the West actually knew the difference between a dark roast oolong or a fully oxidized tea.
Joke's on them.
Yeah, so it is possible that a perfectly good Tielwa Han or a Baiji Guan or a Rogui made it to the bottom of Boston Harbor.
Man, they really missed out.
Yeah, if you look at some of the leaves that they have recovered, they've actually recovered some of the leaves, and they look like strip-styled oolongs. They're longer leaf. They are not a small-leafed Lapsang Souchong style-looking tea. The leaves are larger.
That's amazing. Wow, I did not know that. That is sad.
I know, right? Yeah. I know I'm sounding very un-American by denouncing the Boston Tea Party. But.
Well, so after the Boston Tea Party, it was more, even though the tea was the beverage of choice, it was more like patriotic to drink coffee. Like, oh, we're against tea now, and we're going to drink coffee.
And we spell our words without a U in it. Glamour has no U now.
And color.
Czech does not end in a QUE. It ends in a CK, because Mark.
And we're not using the metric system.
We're going to stick to the old English system. Why? Because America?
Bushels.
America. Yeah, America.
Right. And then in the 1800s, it picked up a little more popularity. Coffee picked up a little more popularity in the U.S. They were cowboys and gold miners in the 1800s were drinking coffee a lot more. And then it really took off once Starbucks kind of came on the scene and was like remarketing coffee in the 70s.
Not only that, but coffee was actually easier to produce because at the time, a lot of the coffee producing regions south of the equator in the New World utilized slave labor, particularly in Brazil and some of the other South American countries. And this was before many of the countries outlawed that horrific practice, and coffee fell out of favor for a time, and tea and some other ones actually gained favor, but that's a whole nother story. Point being, though, is that coffee at the time was easier because it was really easy to find cheap labor to do it.
Yeah, and now tea in the U.S., ever since the Boston Tea Party, that this tea has kind of taken a little more of a step back in terms of being like the drink of choice or the go-to in terms of, what do you drink in the mornings or in the afternoons? It's not so much tea anymore.
With the exception of Southern sweet tea and sun tea and iced tea.
Right. And I think it's now in the U.S. more so it's evolved into a lot of more like a convenience type of tea where it's loose leaf is now it's harder to come by, like quality loose leaf teas, and a lot of the tea consumed in the U.S. is now like very low grade teas, or it's in tea bags, or they're flavored, or there's artificial flavoring, or there's a mix of, not that there's anything against blends, but that's just how a lot of teas are consumed now. It's less of the loose leaf and more of these other convenience varieties.
I'm not going to continually deride that, considering everybody started there, at least. Everybody that kind of looks like me started there. Started with a tea-bagged Moroccan mint or a tea-bagged Lipton something or other. I mean, I have relatives who I have introduced them to loose leaf tea, but they will, just for convenience sake and sometimes even for flavor's sake, will return to the bagged Earl Grey or the Liptons and the Tetleys and such. And part of it is because they actually like the flavor of bitter fannings divided away from water by cloth. Whatever floats your boat.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that there's this kind of move towards the convenient teas, like you'd mentioned, like with the tea bags and whatnot. And
the RTDs, the ready-to-drinks.
Yep, that's a new. I think in the past few years, it's really taken off. Especially, I think it started with like Honest Tea, right? Was there a big one before that?
I don't know if they were the first. they're actually, I should actually know this because they're an Oregon company. I need to look that up.
Yeah, no, that's
Postscript.
Yeah, I think they're owned by Coke now or something like that. Coke or Pepsi, or
I think
one of
you're
the
right.
two. Yeah, one of the two. But with these ready to drink teas, like tea versus coffee, a lot of times when I talk to people about tea, they're like, "Oh, but I think it's like so complicated in terms of how it's brewed, or I'm just a little intimidated by how to make tea." But the concept is similar to like coffee. You're separating what you're steeping away from water, and the time. It's dependent on, like, the flavor is dependent on the time, and so it kind of surprises me that tea has kind of this more intimidating view by many people who when I think, for me, like, coffee is also a little intimidating in terms of like how
Coffee intimidates the heck out of me. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember, the first time I ever had coffee was back in college, and I was working nights, and I thought that would help keep me awake. Then I overbrewed some, did it wrong, got a stomach ache, didn't drink coffee again. Switched to tea a few years after that. But whenever trying to approach coffee, I have a French press, but I never get the measurement right. And then I was told by coffee people or some coffee people, not all, that French pressing coffee is actually inferior compared to slow drip.
Yes.
And you say, yes, it is.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
Yes, I've heard that it is inferior.
I've heard from a friend
asking for a friend.
It is. Yeah.
And I never get the measurement of the bean right because everybody does it their own way. I actually found that grinding my own beans is quite a meditative process, similar to gong fu. I mean, even though it's loud, it's kind of like I am in control of this beverage. Without my hand, these beans have not been ground.
You should record a session of you grinding some coffee beans.
with 70s porn music in the background.
You're like a robot. But that does lead to, you had mentioned something about coffee people, and a few of these articles online that I've been reading about, like tea versus coffee and whatnot, some of them describe, like, sure, there are all these like different ways to cut the market in terms of how to segment this and that market. But really, there's only two: coffee people and tea people. And so I thought it was really funny that you kind of use that term, coffee people.
Yeah, but I used it also incorrectly because I know a lot of tea people. Granted, this might be confirmation bias, but I know a lot of tea people that are secretly coffee people in the morning before they get started.
So why do you think they have to be secretly coffee people?
Because I think that they think that admitting that they drink coffee in the morning delegitimizes their status as a tea drinker. And that kind of goes back to support why a lot of people don't go into loose leaf tea, or more to the point, the single origin stuff, because of this fear of pissing off the effetes.
Yeah, I can see that. But actually, coffee and tea have a lot of similarities, and I kind of listed...
Like all of them.
Yeah, a few. But in terms of flavors and how to describe coffee and describe tea, they, a lot of darker teas have stronger flavors, and so a lot of times in the morning they're taken with milk and sugar to kind of dampen the bitter, like, strong flavors and pull them down a little bit. And that's similar with coffee. If it's roasted and the flavor is very bitter or strong, you use coffee or sugar and milk to kind of bring the flavor down. It's a very similar approach.
And to harken back to our last episode, The reason for cutting back the bitterness is because the moment that you introduce hot water to said plant material, both coffee leaves and tea beans have these things called tannins. Tannins are both beneficial, but they also are what contribute to the bitterness and astringency to the decocted beverage. And some people do it for too long. Some people do it for too short. Believe it or not, when you're French pressing coffee or when you're steeping tea, it's sort of the same practice. I don't know how long you're supposed to wait before you press the bean particles down before you pour the brew, but there is an infusion time.
Yes, there's an infusion time, and there's actually a correct temperature. I know some of my friends, they had this coffee maker, and they were very serious about it because this coffee maker heated the water up to a specific temperature.
190 degrees.
Yeah, okay, 190 degrees. And then it dripped the water at a distance away from the grounds at a certain distance, and then it dripped the coffee at a specific rate so that the water would flow through at a specific time or over a course of time, and so you have the perfect cup of coffee.
And the reason why the coffee beans are ground is so that more of the surface area is exposed to the water, and the amount of water that you introduce and for how long you introduce it actually leads to the amount of tannins or the amount of other stuff, palatal stuff that are released into the beverage before it pours down into the jar or cup or mug or whatever.
Yeah. So that is kind of similar in terms of the flavor, because for tea it's similar. The water temperature is very important depending on the type of tea that you're making, and also the how long you're steeping the tea for. I see a lot of parallels between coffee and tea in prep and also in flavors, and then also with caffeine. So. I think it depends on the brew. A lot of times for tea, I've heard, but I don't know if I fully believe this, is you can decaffeinate your tea.
No, it's lies.
Right?
I actually played around with that several years ago.
Okay.
Where they say that if you steep the leaves for, I think, if you do a pre-wash, that's all it is basically doing a pre-wash in hot water for about 30 to 50 seconds. They say that 80% of the caffeine is released. Well, 80% of something is released, and that's the flavor of the first brew.
Yep.
And sure, I guess some caffeine is eliminated with that first brew, but you're basically still stuck with more caffeine, particularly if you're using whole leaf material, large whole leaf material. And you're still going to get caffeine out of that, and it's not going to be at 20% capacity. It's actually going to still be more like 70 to 80%.
Right. Yeah. So I've also heard this with tea, and I have not experienced, if you just dump out the first steep, that there's less caffeine. I mean, it's in the plant, so it's not like you're going to remove this chemical or the caffeine in the leaf.
That myth really circulated between 2007 and 2008. A lot of companies were actually pushing that, not just companies, but also integrative medicine websites were also pushing that that tea could be, tea caffeine could be removed by this method. And I'm not sure which study finally proved that this was wrong, but somebody did prove it was wrong, and that particular advice has not been used for 10 years.
Yeah. And then in terms of caffeine, so with tea, I think we've spoken about how we can do a higher ratio of tea leaves to water, a shorter steep for kind of a higher caffeine content in our teas. And then I think with coffee, that's similar. I would say that's more of like an espresso way of consuming coffee versus just your regular cup of.
Well, the
coffee.
reason you can use because espresso grounds are about at the same consistency as a coarse powdered green tea, and the reason why you can use as much bean powder as you can for coffee is because coffee beans actually have less caffeine per surface area than tea leaves do. So say you were going to use the same amount of green tea powder or matcha powder as were for an espresso.
Oh my gosh.
you would start hallucinating.
Yeah. That would be a ton of
the Russians, those Russians.
Oh, the Russians.
The Russians actually used to brew tea that strong, and they actually it got the name called zavarka, or sometimes referred to as gulag tea, and brewed at a very, very strong concentrate at about the same amount of leaf ratio as is equal to coffee. You're leading to the point where you're so caffeinated that you start hallucinating. I had a Ceylon that was done as a Zavarka style concentrate out of a samovar once. And I had to use the bathroom in 30 seconds.
Oh my gosh.
And that was a small cup about this size.
Yeah, I think if usually with matcha, you only need a very small bit of matcha, maybe 1 tablespoon.
1 gram, 1.5 grams for a standard usucha style brew up of matcha. If you're going to go a little bit stronger, you go up to, I think. Wait, is it 1.5? I think it's no. Yes, it is. It's 1 to 1.5 grams. And what determines the difference between whether you're doing it thicker or thinner style matcha is the amount of water you used, not the amount of powder.
Right. But for an espresso, so if you were to take the same amount of matcha and put it in an espresso form, that would be
a heart attack.
That would be highly concerning amount of matcha.
Yeah, that would be Leona is walking through walls and the wall is still intact.
Yeah, Leona's face is just planted against the wall and she thinks she's walking through the wall, but no one is moving. Just her.
Thunk, thunk, thunk.
Exactly.
What's wrong with her? Matcha. Just leave it be.
Yeah, she tried something. It's not working.
It's not working. She's not working.
Yeah, she's not working. And I was also reading about, so in our last episode, we were talking about the health benefits of tea.
Yep.
And this article came up about coffee versus tea. And it had this tone of, if you want to drink something for the best of heart health, you should drink tea. If you want to drink something for the best for digestion, you should drink coffee. If you want to drink something that's best for bone health, drink tea. And I was reading this article. I'm like, okay, I get the point of this article. It wants to, if you're on this article searching for something specific, then you just kind of zone in on one specific category. I'm like, what if you just want overall health? Did you just consume a concoction of coffee and tea mix all day so you can take care of all of these things?
I've done that.
Yeah. Wait, you've mixed the two?
Oh yeah. I think later on in the notes, I was going to get to this later, but there's a tea garden in Belthorpe, Queensland, Australia, and I've developed a dialogue with the lead gardener there. The garden is called the Arakai Estate, and they have a sizable tea garden there. But for his father and he planted 30 Arabica bushes on the garden proper just for their personal consumption.
Oh, cool!
And one time last summer, I asked if I could, dude, can I have some of your beans? Hey, dude, can I have some of your beans? Because I wanted to do a terroir experiment, because since he had coffee growing on the garden and tea growing on the garden, I thought it would be kind of cool to see if there were any common notes that could be found, some sort of terroir similarities between them. I found it, which was spoiler alert. I found it, but the other thing is that it was that I decided to take their black tea that they produce, which is kind of this Taiwanese-inspired black tea, which is really good, and I mixed it with a medium roast coffee that he made, and it was kind of lovely, actually. And I felt kind of lovely. I felt like a pretty little girl. No,
Geoff, you are lovely. So that's amazing. And they don't have any intention of selling these coffee beans. They're just completely for personal use.
It's just for personal use, and it was all because they hated all the other coffees that were grown in Australia, so they decided to do their own.
Well, that could be the start of something right there.
Yeah, I mean, there are gardens that exist that do grow both coffee and tea. The aforementioned garden in Papua New Guinea called Madan, the Madan Plantation, which is rainforest certified and tribal owned and all other buzzwords that hippies like.
Right.
But and I'm really liking this white tea. I'm on steep 3. And there's another one in the country of Malawi in Africa. They're also family owned, and they do both coffee and tea. I've not actually had the coffee, so I can't attest to it, but I've had plenty of their tea.
Okay.
And if they're putting as much care that they put in their tea as they are their coffee, then I'm going to assume it's good. And their plot I'm really interested in trying, because the difference between the coffee plot and the tea plot that they have on the garden is maybe a pathway. So they are literally occupying the same terroir.
That's awesome. That's very cool. It would be interesting to see how it would be if it was like a tea plant, a coffee plant, a tea plant, a coffee plant. You know,
that
like
would be
a true kind of orchard
true
style.
So, yeah.
That would be very cool.
And I actually was joking around, I think on Twitter, because they're growing coffee now in Yunnan. Well, first off, preface, this pisses Pu'er people off, especially the fact that a lot of the coffee roasting is happening in Pu'er City.
Yeah.
And everybody's thinking, and then that sort of led to this belief that Pu'er gardens are being ripped out in favor of coffee gardens. And I'm like, have you seen the price of matcha? No, they're not doing that.
Right. They wouldn't.
No. But I've had Yunnan coffee before, and it actually tastes like Dian Hong, which is bizarre.
That is
really, really thickly brewed Dian Hong, but that's the only way to have it, right?
That's
So I wondered if they could actually process coffee leaves the same way that they process pu'er and then cake it and create this sacrilegious pu'er cake.
I don't know if coffee leaves would. Maybe try that on its own first. Wait, you mean coffee bean or coffee leaves?
Coffee leaves.
Oh, you do mean coffee leaves?
I've had coffee leaves. There's a company out in Vancouver, British Columbia that source Nicaraguan coffee leaves, and they semi-oxidize them and sell them and blend them and stuff, and they're pretty good.
Really? Just by themselves?
Just
it's in the blend.
The production of the product is actually done in Nicaragua proper, and it was to create a sustainable product outside of the norm, because coffee can only be grown for like 3 or 4 months, I think. And so the rest of the year, the farmers actually have to find other jobs.
Right.
And so they developed this idea as a way to create a sustainable product, because the coffee plant, like the tea plant, is perennial. So the coffee leaves are always there.
Right.
And I'm not exactly sure as to the chemical or pallatial value of a coffee leaf in the off season, but I'm assuming that they could be processed the same way. Anyway.
And so these are the ones in Nicaragua. They're the trees that were cut down to be bushes, right? I mean, I think the coffee.
I don't know exactly what they look like. The coffee there from the gardens that they source from. The company's called Wise Monkey, by the way. The bushes are shade grown, so there are actually taller trees that cover the coffee plants. And
Okay.
I think I've actually had shade-grown coffee once, but I don't remember the palate difference. Who cares? Point being is that when processed a different way other than just fully like regularly dried like a normal herbal, coffee leaves can impart a rather pleasing flavor.
Interesting.
But I've also had it dried and it was kind of gross.
Yeah.
It kind of tasted like stinging nettle. But
That sounds great.
But oxidized, yeah, stinging nettle is harkening back to our health benefits episode. Yeah, it tastes like herb.
Right. So I have not had coffee. I haven't had coffee leaves, but what I've had in terms of this middle ground between coffee and tea, because I think normally there's this like great divide between like coffee and tea. It's like
Yep.
you either like it or you don't like it. And if you are a coffee person drinking tea, you're making a compromise. And if you're a tea person drinking coffee, you're also making a compromise on both ends. But there are some shops that have coffee infused, or not coffee infused, but it's a tea blend that has coffee beans inside of it, like as part of the blend. So it's, I think a lot of times it's like dark tea, or not black tea, or darker oolongs, and then they will put some coffee beans in with some maybe.
I could see that working with a chaud pour.
Like the notes would complement each other, and
Yeah.
the mix is pretty good. But I think that type of blend is like a trying to place a product in the middle of this great divide between coffee and tea. Like you don't have to fully give up your, what you want. You can have a little bit of both, but
Then it's entering into the territory of what's the word I'm looking for? Not catering.
like you're kind of making a
Pandering.
yeah.
Pandering. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've actually had green coffee beans that were ground and mixed with green tea before.
And how's that?
Tastes like green tea.
Yeah.
I actually want to try green coffee, but every time I've gone to a coffee place and asked where I could get some, or if it was even possible to do so, or anybody that prepared it,
Yeah.
they looked at me like I had just stabbed a puppy right in front of them. It was like, "Hey, where can I dump this body?" They give me that horrified look that I shouldn't even be mentioning green coffee. But
The door's behind you, sir. And
but apparently, I could just do it myself by just buying green beans and grinding them and prepping the brew myself. I guess
that's
but
true.
I don't know.
Yeah. So you were pulling out your box of tea, or your tea storage box earlier, which is a cardboard box of
Yes.
teas.
To show off a bit of sacrilege.
Okay.
Since we were
What
talking
is
about
this?
coffee leaves.
All right. So
I actually
so Geoff is pouring something out of like a tea,
I am
his
totally.
tea bag right now.
This is improvised content.
So
folks,
far, it sounds like tea.
but it's not. This is actually something I made that I made for somebody
That you made.
else. Well, it contains the aforementioned coffee leaf,
Okay.
but I also mixed it with ground kescara.
Okay.
And
okay.
Have you heard of kescara before?
I have not.
Kescara is tea made from dried coffee cherry husks.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How did you get a hold of that?
This is Portland. You can get a hold of anything,
Oh, true.
especially if it's coffee related.
Yeah.
I actually got this from, I believe, Smith Tea Maker. The coffee cherries I got from Smith Tea Maker.
Okay.
And the coffee leaf I got from Wise Monkey. And I decided, well, one's Arabica coffee cherry husks from El Salvador. One's from the coffee leaf from Nicaragua. I'm just gonna blend it.
Yeah. Right.
And I thought it turned out okay. The person I handed it to were kind of like, "What the hell is this?"
Was it a friend or was it an enemy?
Relative, so little both.
Yes.
I love you. You know who you are.
You know who you are. I don't need to say your name. So would you think about putting, when you were at the World Tea Expo, there was a oh gosh, I forgot what type of tea it is, but it was like a matcha, but was it a Ceylon or was it was like a darker ground type of tea, but it was not matcha.
It was an Assamese green tea that was ground into a powder.
Okay.
I didn't try it because it didn't look right.
Right. The color was off.
It was a little off, and a few years ago I had a fairly adventurous palate. I would try anything once, but nowadays I'm kind of like, I think I'd be better off. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the blending of tea and coffee is a good attempt, but in terms of actually kind of closing the divide between coffee drinkers and tea drinkers, I think is a little tough. You have something else that you want to?
No.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. Let's take a quick break, and I'll talk to you in a few.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Hi there, I'm David.
And I'm Kate.
And we're the hosts of another Zelda podcast.
There are so many good podcasts out there, and some of them in particular concern the Legend of Zelda.
That's right, Kate, and we are another one of them. That is actually the name of our show, Another Zelda Podcast.
And in our show in particular, we talk about some of our favorite dungeons, characters, boss battles. We have top 10 lists.
Yeah, we do deep dives on game design and production aspects of the different Zelda games.
And we talk about our own experiences. We do some review episodes, talk about our challenges, our struggles, and our victories.
That's right. Really just almost anything that has to do with Zelda, we like to talk about it. A new episode comes out every other Friday, and you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and YouTube.
And you can also check out our episodes on our website, anotherzeldapodcast.com.
That's right. All right, we will see you there.
Okay, bye.
Hi everyone, welcome back from the break. And prior to the break, we were chatting a little bit about some different differences between tea and coffee in terms of the flavor, caffeine content, and then also the different plantations. Some of them were growing coffee and are trying tea, and some were initially starting with tea and now going into coffee as well. And that kind of reminded me, you had one here that was a third generation Belgian owned garden. It kind of reminded me of this company, or not this company, but there's this beer that was kind of manufactured now or produced in China in this region that was previously, they had never made beer because beer was not really a big thing in China before. And so they kind of explored it because it was like settled by like these German colonists, whatnot. And so now this beer is produced in China.
These German colonists didn't settle in the 1940s, did they?
No. No, they didn't. And
they weren't escaping anything, were they?
No, I don't think so, but I can confirm. But they basically brought these techniques of how to manufacture beer into China, and now that is Qingdao beer. And that kind of reminded me a lot of these, like you were saying, in Yunnan, traditionally it's tea, but now they're bringing in coffee and kind of taking on these other experiences based on the market, because why limit yourself to tea when you have the ability or the know-how or you can try both and sell to both markets. And
considering the fact that I believe it is southeastern Yunnan and northeastern Yunnan are actually perfect for coffee growing because they're more. I'm not as familiar with the climate there, but there are parts of Yunnan that are extremely dry and parts that are extremely wet based upon how subtropical they are. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the regions are perfect, including in and around Pu'er City for coffee proliferation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. In terms of just making the most out of the land that you have, like why not be able to do both if you can, you know?
Yeah.
So in terms of coffee in the U.S., coffee kind of took off in the U.S. after the Boston Tea Party, as we had mentioned before the break, in 1773, and since then, coffee shops are everywhere, but tea shops are kind of like far and few, and when you find a tea shop, it's a very exciting thing, at least for me.
It is too, for me.
Because coffee, you can grab a coffee at, I don't know, Starbucks, Caribou, a local coffee shop, Intelligentsia, a lot of chain coffee shops and smaller coffee shops. And the only large chain I know of here is that I've seen, and when I say chain, I mean like more than 10 shops, is Argo Teas.
Oh yeah, I know.
I don't know
Argo.
if you have a lot of Argo teas in Portland, but here it's one of the tea shops, and while they don't it's not like a very traditional tea shop. I think what it does do is it's able to match kind of like the Starbucks feel, but for tea, and it makes it, I think, a little less intimidating to go to a tea shop, because you have these fun products like boba tea that they're offering now, and you can have unsweetened or sweetened tea, and they have kind of like nice fruity blends of different teas, so you can try an oolong, but you don't have to fully commit to just an oolong, but you can have like a peach flavor on top of the oolong. So I think it's kind of like a nice compromise of like diving in and having to be very serious about tea.
Yeah, we have a few urban chic coffee chains here. Specifically Townsend Teas, I would classify as that. I mean, they have some good single origin stuff, but they are principally for the young consumer who's just coming in, who has an introductory knowledge to tea, but still wants the comfort and ambiance of an urban coffee joint.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. And there are some coffee shops where they have a very kind of traditional setting, where they have the gaiwans, or they have the loose leaf teas, and I think for that it's a little more difficult. You don't really see a lot of people going to those type of tea shops to work on their laptops, or to do homework or whatnot, something like that. And in terms of what tea is and what coffee is and the overall experience, I think coffee, so when I first think of coffee, I think of coffee as like, I'm going to drink my coffee and I'm going to get this done. Like whatever task I needed to get done, that's a task for coffee. It's like more high intensity, more efficiency.
But first, let me drink my coffee.
Right, like a checklist. Like before I start the day, if I really want to, it's a more high intensity situation for if I need to drink like something like coffee. And for me, when I think of drinking tea, it's like, well, I'm just going to relax and kind of think about life and the day and enjoy the flavor of tea. It's a definitely more relaxing activity that complements the beverage, in terms of my experience.
Also, courtship. Coffee is the beverage of courtship.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that when you meet somebody for an introductory date, it's usually a coffee date. It is not a tea date.
Right.
A tea date is for when you want to get together with a friend, or what could be labeled as a friend, whereas a coffee date is considered the prelude to romance, whereas tea or tea outings are for those that already are in a relationship.
Right. And why do you think that is, that tea is not a prelude to...
I have no idea, but there is actual science that backs this up.
There is?
I remember years ago, I attended one of those bar quiz night things.
Okay.
And it actually somebody basically said that there was a study done of who actually had more relations,
Okay.
coffee people or tea people. And at the time, I was kind of like, well, there's proof that tea is really good for that kind of thing, so I'm going to guess tea people. And then the group bought into my answer because I sounded very authoritative about it.
Right. Shocking.
It was coffee people. Coffee people have more relations than tea people do.
That's interesting. I wonder
Yeah,
how they...
not only that, I cost us the game.
Oh, man. Sorry
So
about that.
it was a double win.
I would be interested to read that study.
I wish I should have. I should have
No,
tried
we
to
can
look that up.
No,
but
we
I
can
just
look it up. Yeah.
I just thought about it like right now. Yeah.
I just think that's very interesting. That for your experience, tea is more like a friendship, and coffee is more like a
Not just friendship and relationship. I
friendship
mean,
and
the
right.
people that you will find in a tea joint that are together have been together for a while.
I see.
It is the old couple in a park on a bench holding hands beverage.
That's true. I guess it's not a older couple in the park drinking coffee. Maybe
Which sounds
if you're
great to me. Which sounds absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. So another kind of cultural thing with tea is that coffee, you don't usually have a coffee party. So
A
coffee party. So you don't invite your friends over. You don't prepare a ton of snacks or sandwiches, varying from sweets to sandwiches and some scones. And you don't have them over and say, "Hey, I'm gonna throw a coffee party on
Would
Friday."
it make me less manly when I say that I love those kind of parties?
I love those parties, and no, I don't
tea
think so.
shops that host those kinds of parties.
Yes, and that's the exact point, is that with tea is like a gathering beverage.
Yes.
And tea is one that you enjoy with people. You have people over and you share the experience of tea with people. And tea complements a lot of foods really well. Coffee, I think
agree.
Coffee, there's a lot of foods that you can't consume when you're drinking coffee.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Coffee really does not pair very well with food, except donuts.
And coffee cake, which is
And
why
coffee cake. And biscotti.
right, foods made to specifically complement coffee.
Specifically designed to complement coffee.
Right.
Whereas teas are specifically meant to complement other foods.
Right.
And I know several bloggers that could go off on a litany of different teas and foods that can pair well. And probably take up an entire episode of this show listing them all.
right. And so when I think about tea and coffee, I think of coffee as more of like a solitary beverage. You don't. I don't think anyone would go to a coffee party if you invited 10 friends over and said, "Hey, I'm gonna have coffee. You guys want to come over?" I think everyone would kind of
the
say,
only
like,
way that
"I'm
works
busy."
is if it's already an existing party and coffee is offered, like a dinner party that's just getting
Yes.
started and something to go along with the appetizers. Coffee is sometimes offered, but it's not specifically a coffee party.
Right.
And that's the excuse for the gathering.
Exactly. But with tea, it's like, you have high tea, you have tea parties, you have
Yeah.
all of these things. It's a very like community sharing kind of experience, which I think is a very cool thing about tea.
It
Not
is.
biased at all, but
Bias aside, I mean, yeah, a lot of the best gatherings I've ever been to that are tea centric. I mean, tea is the introductory thing, and then everything else segues from there, as opposed to the existing gathering, and then some other people segue off to have coffee.
right. And even on I post every so often on Instagram on different teas and tea wares that I have or I'm using, and several of my friends have said, like, "I'm coming over," or "When are you having me over for tea?" And I don't see that so much on like a picture of a coffee, like a cup of coffee, like, "Oh, you're having coffee? When can I come over?"
There's only one dude on Instagram where where I'm tempted every time he posts a picture of a coffee. I'm kind of like, dude, I want to go to I want to go to Boulder, Colorado, and just have coffee with you. And yeah, it's this guy named Peter who I actually wrote about a couple of weeks ago because he's the one that provided a couple of Darjeelings for me, and he's the general manager of a coffee bar called Trident, which also happens to have one of the most extensive tea menus I've ever run into. And he posts about all of these weird teas that they have, but he also posts about all of the weird coffees that they have.
Oh, that's cool.
Like one time he was talking about this coffee that he got from the Galapagos Islands, and I was just like, I want to get on a plane now.
How did he get? Okay, that's I will research that after the show. But that does bring up one point, is that in a lot of restaurants, if you are drinking tea versus when you're when you're drinking coffee in a restaurant, they usually have a pretty good selection of coffee in terms of not having the lowest grade coffee there for you to drink if you go to a restaurant. However, and not the best either, but when you are a tea drinker and you go to a restaurant and you say you would like some tea, they give you a box of tea bags. That is a
box of tea bags.
Either
and
a box
if you're lucky, they're stashed tea bags. If you're unlucky, they are
like Lipton
any of the other litany.
Right. Lipton, something in a plastic or a paper folded tea bag
thing,
right?
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to enjoy tea outside of your own home, I think. In terms of there's fewer tea shops, there's fewer selections when you go out to restaurants. I think the knowledge about tea and tea drinkers and the quality of tea and tea leaves is increasing, especially in nicer restaurants and in a lot of hotels. They are having a better selection of teas, but in terms of the actual enjoyment of tea outside of your own home, I think it's tricky when you are used to having nice loose leaf, whole leaf teas.
Harkening back to World Tea Expo, I actually attended a class put on by a well-known tea writer by the name of Max Falkowitz, who detailed why restaurants serve bad tea as opposed to serving some of the good stuff. And a lot of it is just the practicality of it, because tea has to be made in bulk, and sometimes they don't have if they're handling multiple orders and they have multiple orders of people that are ordering tea, it's really hard to find space to range out all the teas that are steeping for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, or even if they're doing the shorter steep ones. So one of the fixes that he suggested for restaurants is find a tea that can steep forever and use that, like a roasted green tea from Japan or a roasted barley tea. But something that you can basically make in bulk that will last the duration of hours. Because roasted bancha or hojicha or roasted kukicha for that matter, they don't really change or get more tannic the longer they brew. They actually kind of get a little bit more roasty and comfortable.
Right. And a lot of shops like Argo, what they do with their tea is they have a huge kind of a clear vat, and they just prepare a ton of tea and they just let it sit there.
They put it in a carafe, sometimes even carafes that are usually meant for coffee.
Right, exactly. So that is one, I think, difficulty when you're a tea drinker. When you go out, you kind of almost have to not make a scene, I guess, when there's a lack of good tea selection.
Well, and as we've discussed, sometimes we're that guy or that girl that will basically, can I just get hot water?
Yes, I have done that at a Starbucks. I'm sorry, Starbucks.
I've done that at diners where I'm just like, I'll just take hot water.
Yeah, I'm like, and then I just grab the tea out of my bag and just make my own tea. I'll be here for 3 hours, but don't worry, I just need water from you.
I don't do that with pu'er so much anymore, because pu'er, especially if it's like a chunk of a cake, it actually looks like marijuana.
Yes, it does. And so on an earlier episode, you had mentioned something about needing like in the morning saying something like, oh, I haven't had my coffee yet, like don't, a lot of times I think at work it's like a nice excuse for like putting off certain things. Whereas like that line doesn't deliver as well if you replace coffee with tea.
I haven't had the line works well if you were Irish or British.
Right. But in the U.S.
Actually, it might even work if you're Russian, too. Do not bother. Have not had tea yet.
Right. But I think in terms of the use of like, oh, I haven't had my coffee yet. But if you say like, I haven't had my tea yet, just be like, okay, well.
At the place I used to work, I mean, everybody knew that I was a big-time loose-leaf tea drinker, but there were a few times where I would come in and I would look incredibly grumpy and I'd just walk all the way over to the restaurant section and just give a weak smile to the barista and he would know that it was a day I did not sleep well and I needed a double shot espresso.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of is that same thing. Like, oh, he hasn't had his coffee yet. Yeah. So another, I guess, similarity between coffee and tea is that they both have kind of like sommeliers and these associations of like verification and certification on both ends. So in coffee, that's like the Specialty Coffee Association. And in tea, there's the Tea Association, and you had put down the American Specialty Tea Alliance as well.
The American Specialty Tea Alliance, which I'm not exactly promoting as much as I am recognizing it as its mission statement is to actually become more of a centralized resource and source for tea education. Because right now, unlike with the coffee world where there is, I think there is, like the coffee world and the wine world, I believe, have a centralized, standardized educational system of what is used for certification. Tea does not. Tea has like 10 to 15, and that's only in the West. I mean, you have many different certification programs that you could go through. You could go through ITCC or ITTC. I don't remember the exact acronym. Point being is there are a lot of them, and the American Specialty Tea Alliance is trying to, among many other goals, to centralize or standardize what is proper tea knowledge. Not proper tea knowledge as in you have to put your pinky out to balance the cup properly. No, it's a matter of standardizing what the knowledge base is.
Right, in terms of getting the certification, since there are so many ways or companies to receive different types of certification. Yeah, I think that's definitely important. And then another similarity is that cooking with coffee and cooking with tea is so I put this on here because there's a lot of, I think more recently there's a lot of bloggers and recipes that now include matcha or different tea infusions, and even maybe it's not cooking, but even certain cocktails that are now bringing in like notes of different flavors of like teas in terms of oolongs or green teas in making cocktails, whereas coffee I think is the same. There's a lot of different baking that is done with coffee flavors and a lot of cocktails that are made with coffee. So that's another kind of similarity that I've seen with coffee and tea.
I think the tea folks are having more fun with the recipes because tea is a little. I'm not trying to say that it's superior, but it is when it comes to being added to culinary dishes, not just as a pairing, but actually an ingredient, and not just matcha being used as the ingredient. In fact, a lot of recipe-oriented bloggers, particularly ones that I know personally, have sort of moved away from using just matcha as the primary ingredient, because matcha is just powder. You can basically just throw it in and
it's easy.
Yay! Now I have a green loaf of bread.
Right.
But particularly there's one in San Francisco who's a friend of mine, Anna, the tea squirrel. She does a lot of different recipes with other teas besides matcha, and she does it with this Italian touch, and it's just kind of like, God, I want to try all the things.
Right. And I think that it's with tea, you can kind of have a wider variety of flavors other than just this than a standard coffee flavor.
Yeah.
When you're cooking, because oolongs are going to taste very different from greens, they're going to taste very different from black teas and even matchas. So there's kind of a wider reach when you're exploring flavors or pairings with tea infusions or different teas. So
And back before I became a teetotaler, literally, I actually found tea-infused beers or tea leaf-infused beers to be more versatile than beers that were made with coffee, like the espresso stouts or the coffee porters and all those. They all kind of had the same notes, as opposed to a Essentia IPA or I don't think I ever had anything that was made with matcha, but I did have an Earl Grey Saison. I did have an Earl Grey.
Nice.
Earl Grey is great for beers.
yeah, Earl Grey is nice with pairings. It has a very strong, like distinct flavor that you're able to pull out very whatever it's infused or kind of combined with. It's like a very very clear note. So awesome. Cool. So I think we covered quite a few similarities and differences in tea and coffee, but I think overall, if you love the beverage, like I would be okay trying different types of coffees. I don't feel like I'm abandoning my position as being a lover of tea.
I actually should use this closing point to issue an apology to a friend of mine.
Okay.
Ex-friend actually, because we actually stopped talking because of this incident, and it was me at my tea snobbiest, and they had a malfunction with an espresso machine.
Okay.
And I was just like, why are you brewing espresso when you could, tea would be so much easier than this. You put it in the press and then done. And I look back at it and I was being a huge jerk. And so I owe that person an apology, considering the fact that now I am that guy that occasionally has to turn to an espresso in the morning if I haven't slept for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just had to do that because I think that's the my end all goal for this episode was just to say, coffee people, over the years, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And
I'm not sorry that you're coffee people. I am sorry that I derided coffee people.
Right.
Because both can coexist and sometimes both can interchange their beverages.
Yes. And I think when you first start learning about something or first explore a new beverage or a new idea, I think a lot of times you're 100% committed to it. And you're like, I can't be both. But once you get to a point where you're so comfortable within that space that you've explored it, you have a good understanding of it, then you're able to kind of be more accepting of all of that's for me at least. In the beginning, I was very like, I don't drink coffee. I refused to drink coffee for a very long time. And now it's just, all right, it's just another beverage. It's not, I'm not making a statement by suddenly not drinking tea or
one of the best coffees I have currently at home I got through a tea shop.
Yeah.
It was a coffee from the Philippines, and got it through a company that I mentioned prior called Charities, and the stuff had tea-ish notes, and it was light and it was sweet, and I didn't mean to segue away again.
No, it's okay.
But, and I actually bought half kilo of this stuff because it was that good.
Yeah, I think it's great that tea shops are now offering coffee or some type of tea and coffee blend, and coffee shops now more often than not also offer tea. So if you're there and you're looking to explore or try something new, you can do that without having to feel like you need to go to a completely different environment or a different place. So I think that's great. So yeah. So Geoff, if people want to get a hold of you or want to read more of your articles, where can they find you?
just look up the Lazy Literatus on any sort of social media platform other than Pinterest. And my blog is steepstories.com.
Awesome. And if our listeners and audience want to comment on anything that we've talked about in this episode, or want to share their thoughts on the tea versus coffee topic, you can find us at the Tea Fix on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can also comment on our videos on YouTube as well. Awesome. Jeff, thanks. This was a great chat.
Thank you.
All
and
right.
again, coffee people, I'm sorry.
All right. Well, I'll chat with you in a few. Okay, bye. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please subscribe and rate the show on iTunes, YouTube, and Google Play. This helps other listeners find our show, and if you'd like, please leave us a review. Thanks!